Happy birthday to my biggest disappointment. Garrett Brennan raised his wine glass as his Meridian Pharmaceuticals colleagues snickered around our table at Pinnacle, the exclusive restaurant on the 52nd floor of Skyline Tower. Maybe, this year, you'll finally contribute something meaningful to our marriage, instead of playing with dusty paintings all day. I sat across from my husband of 3 years, my hands folded calmly in my lap despite the familiar sting of his words. The soft lighting of the restaurant cast a warm glow across the white linen tablecloth. But nothing could soften the coldness in Garrett's eyes as he delivered what he clearly thought was a devastating blow to my self-worth on my 29th birthday. Quinn Sterling, Meridian's vice president of sales, lifted her glass in mock solidarity. At least she has hobbies while you're out there making real money, Garrett. Some wives just collect shoes. Museum work is basically volunteer babysitting for rich people's art collections, added Reed Hartwell, the research director, his voice carrying that particular condescension reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. I mean, $45,000 a year to look at paintings? My teenage nephew makes more working summers at the country club. Savannah Cross, the marketing head, leaned forward with fake sympathy painted across her perfectly contoured face. I could never marry someone so unambitious. But I suppose everyone has different standards. The laughter that erupted from their table was sharp and cutting, designed to slice through whatever dignity I might have left. I maintained my composure, taking a small sip of water while studying the faces around me. These people had no idea they were sitting 52 floors above the street, in a building I owned, eating dinner paid for by profits from a company I controlled, mocking a woman whose signature appeared on every one of their paychecks. But they would learn soon enough. The waitress approached our table with practiced discretion, refilling water glasses with the kind of attentive service that Pinnacle was known for. When she reached my glass, she paused almost imperceptibly. "Will there be anything else this evening, miss?" The question was directed at me, despite the obvious wedding ring on my finger and the fact that Garrett had made the reservation. "We're fine for now, thank you," I replied softly, noting how she nodded with unusual deference before moving away. Garrett was too absorbed in explaining to Reed why the company's latest drug trial was destined for FDA approval to notice the exchange. But I caught Quinn's slight frown as she registered the waitress's respectful tone. My phone buzzed against the table, the screen lighting up with a text from building management about quarterly reports. I quickly silenced it and slipped the device back into my purse, but not before Garrett caught sight of the notification. "Building management?" He laughed, the sound harsh against the restaurant's refined atmosphere. "What? Is your landlord texting you about late rent now? That's embarrassing, even for you." "It's nothing important," I said, which was technically true. The quarterly reports could wait until tomorrow. What mattered tonight was maintaining the carefully constructed fiction that had become my life, at least until I decided whether this marriage was worth salvaging, or if Garrett had finally revealed his true character beyond any doubt. 3 years ago, when I first moved to Denver and took the position as a curator at the Museum of Natural History, I had been searching for something that money couldn't buy: authenticity. After inheriting Meridian Pharmaceuticals at 21 following my parents' tragic plane crash, I had learned the hard way that wealth attracted the wrong kind of attention. 3 previous relationships had ended the same way, with men who saw dollar signs instead of the woman behind them. So I had made a radical decision. I moved to a new city, took a modest job managing the Meridian Foundation's $200 million art collection under my hyphenated maiden name, Dakota Meridian Hayes, and lived as simply as possible. I rented a small apartment, drove a reliable Honda, and presented myself to the world as exactly what I appeared to be: a hard-working museum professional making an honest middle-class living. The plan had been to find someone who could love me for who I was, not what I owned. For the first year of our relationship, Garrett had seemed like that person. He was ambitious, but not greedy, successful but not arrogant, attentive without being possessive. Or, so I had thought. Garrett tells us you work at that little museum downtown, Savannah said, her tone suggesting she was discussing something mildly distasteful. How quaint. Do you get to dust the exhibits personally? Or do they have actual janitors for that? The group erupted in fresh laughter, but I noticed something interesting. As their voices rose, conversations at nearby tables began to quiet. Other diners were starting to pay attention to the spectacle Garrett was orchestrating, and not in the way he might have hoped. The clientele at Pinnacle weren't the type to appreciate public displays of cruelty, no matter how cleverly disguised as humor. Actually, I said calmly, I specialize in authentication and acquisition. It's quite fascinating work when you understand the historical significance of what you're preserving. Historical significance, Reed repeated mockingly. Listen to that, Quinn. She thinks looking at old stuff makes her an intellectual. Better than pushing pills that may or may not actually help people, I replied. My voice still level, but carrying just enough edge to make Reed's face redden slightly. Garrett's eyes narrowed dangerously. He didn't like it when I showed even the slightest hint of defiance, especially in front of his colleagues. Careful, honey? We both know which one of us actually contributes to society. Meridian Pharmaceuticals has saved more lives in the last year than your little museum has educated minds in the last decade. The irony of his statement was so profound that I almost smiled. Meridian Pharmaceuticals had indeed saved countless lives, but not because of anything Garrett had done. The breakthrough treatments he was so proud of marketing had been developed using research grants that I personally approved, in facilities that I owned, by scientists whose salaries came from accounts that I managed. He was a middle management regional director who had convinced himself he was essential to an operation that could function perfectly well without him. If you're enjoying watching someone who's been completely underestimated start to reveal their true power, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones prove they've been holding all the cards the entire time. Speaking of contributions, Quinn said, leaning back in her chair with the satisfied air of someone about to deliver what she considered a killing blow. Didn't Garrett mention that you've been having trouble with your student loans lately? It must be so stressful trying to make ends meet on a curator's salary while your husband is moving up in the pharmaceutical world. Student loans. I almost laughed out loud at that one. The monthly payments Garrett had noticed leaving my account weren't loan repayments. They were research grants I distributed to medical universities across the country. But explaining that would have required revealing exactly how much money I had available to distribute, which would have defeated the entire purpose of my carefully maintained cover. Everyone has financial obligations, I said diplomatically. It's part of being a responsible adult. Some more than others, Garrett muttered, signaling the waitress for another bottle of wine. At least when I get that promotion to senior regional director next month, we'll finally have some real money coming in. Maybe then you can think about finding a career that actually pays enough to support itself. Senior regional director. I made a mental note to ask my actual senior regional director, Patricia Williams, about that supposed promotion. As far as I knew, there were no openings at that level, and Garrett's performance reviews had been adequate at best. He seemed to have confused his own ambitions with reality, a dangerous habit that was becoming increasingly common. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Autumn B. I declined it quickly, but not before Garrett caught sight of the name on the screen. Autumn B? He grabbed my wrist before I could put the phone away. Who the hell is Autumn B? And why is she calling you at 9:30 on a Saturday night? A friend from college, I lied smoothly, gently extracting my wrist from his grip. She probably forgot about the time difference. You know how scattered artists can be. Autumn Blackwood was actually my family attorney, and if she was calling this late on a weekend, it meant something significant had developed that required my immediate attention. But explaining that would have opened doors I wasn't ready to walk through. Not yet. Artists, Reed said, with obvious disdain. Let me guess. Another one of your museum friends who thinks the world owes her a living? Because she can paint pretty pictures. Something like that, I agreed, though Autumn was actually one of the most sharp minded corporate lawyers in the country, specializing in pharmaceutical patent law and inheritance planning. She had been instrumental in helping me structure my finances in a way that allowed me to live this double life without raising suspicions. Garrett's grip on his wine glass tightened. You know what your problem is, Dakota? You surround yourself with other failures and then act surprised when nothing in your life improves. Maybe if you spent time with people who actually accomplish things, some of their success might rub off on you. The comment hit exactly the way he intended it to. And for a moment, I felt the familiar wave of hurt that his casual cruelty always produced. But underneath that hurt was something else: anger, cold, and sharp, and thoroughly justified. I had spent 3 years trying to give him the chance to love me for who I was underneath the money and power. And what I had discovered was that without those things to impress him, he felt free to treat me with open contempt. You're right, I said quietly. I should probably be more careful about the company I keep. Something in my tone must have registered, because his expression flickered briefly with uncertainty. But Quinn was already launching into another attack, and the moment passed. I mean, honestly, what do you even do all day at that museum? She pressed. It's not like people are lining up to see whatever dusty artifacts they've got collecting cobwebs in there. The Meridian Foundation collection is actually quite prestigious, I replied calmly. We have pieces on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Smithsonian in Washington, and the British Museum in London. Last month alone, we had delegations from 3 different countries requesting access to our research archives. The table fell silent for a moment as they processed this information. It was more than I usually revealed about my work, but I was beginning to feel the constraints of my carefully constructed humble persona becoming unbearable. The Meridian Foundation, Savannah repeated slowly. That sounds familiar. Didn't they sponsor that big gala at the Denver Art Museum last spring? The one where tickets were $10,000 each? I wouldn't know about ticket prices, I said truthfully. As the foundation's primary benefactor, I hadn't needed to purchase admission. I just handle the day-to-day management of the collection. Garrett's eyes narrowed as he studied my face. You never mentioned working with anything that high profile before. Are you sure you're not exaggerating your importance just a little bit? I'm sure, I said simply, meeting his gaze steadily. Before he could press further, the waitress returned to our table carrying leather check presenters. Will this be separate checks this evening, or all together? All together, Garrett said without hesitation, his voice carrying the kind of casual assumption that made my jaw clench. And bring it to me, obviously. The waitress glanced at me briefly, and I caught something that might have been sympathy in her expression before she nodded and walked away. Garrett immediately turned back to his colleagues, launching into a story about some client presentation that I had heard at least 3 times before. But I found myself studying the restaurant around us with new eyes. Pinnacle occupied the entire 52nd floor of Skyline Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of Denver's skyline and the Rocky Mountains beyond. The interior design was quietly elegant, all warm wood and soft lighting and carefully curated art pieces that complemented, rather than competed with the spectacular views. I had approved every detail of the renovation personally, working with the architect and interior designer to create exactly the kind of space where Denver's elite would feel comfortable conducting both business and pleasure. The building itself was a testament to modern engineering, 54 floors of steel and glass that had redefined the city's downtown core when construction was completed 5 years ago. The bottom 20 floors housed retail spaces and professional offices. Floors 21 through 40 contained luxury condominiums, and the top 14 floors were reserved for premium office space and amenities like the restaurant where we currently sat. Meridian Pharmaceuticals occupied floors 15 through 23, with the executive offices on 23 commanding some of the best views in the city. Garrett's office was on floor 18, a corner space that he had lobbied for aggressively and been granted as much for his persistence as his performance. He had no idea that his nameplate on that office door existed entirely at my discretion, or that the lease payments for all of Meridian's space in the building ultimately flowed back to accounts that I controlled. "The check, sir," the waitress said, placing the leather folder in front of Garrett with practiced efficiency. He opened it with the confident air of someone who had never worried about being able to cover a restaurant bill, glanced at the total, and slid the folder across the table to me. "Your birthday? Your treat?" he announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. $847. Hope you've been saving your pennies." The table erupted in fresh laughter as I opened the folder and studied the itemized bill. 2 bottles of wine at $180 each, appetizers, entrees, desserts, and the kind of premium ingredients that justified Pinnacle's reputation as one of Denver's most expensive restaurants. Under normal circumstances, $800 would represent a significant portion of a museum curator's monthly budget. I reached into my purse and pulled out my credit card, the one with Meridian Foundation, discreetly printed above my name. The metallic surface caught the restaurant's warm lighting as I placed it in the folder, but none of Garrett's colleagues seemed to notice the unusual weight of the black card or the lack of a visible credit limit. "How generous of you to pick up the check, Dakota," Quinn said with false sweetness. "It's so refreshing to see a woman who doesn't expect her husband to pay for everything." "Everyone should contribute according to their ability," I replied, closing the folder and waiting for the waitress to return. "Exactly," Garrett agreed, his voice heavy with satisfaction. "It's about time you started pulling your weight financially. Maybe this is the beginning of a more balanced partnership." The waitress returned within minutes, processed the payment with the kind of discretion that expensive restaurants are known for, and brought back the receipt for me to sign. As I added a 20% tip and scrawled my signature across the bottom, I noticed her glancing at the name on the card with what might have been recognition. "Thank you for dining with us this evening," she said, addressing the comment to me specifically rather than to Garrett, who had made the reservation. "We hope you'll visit us again soon." "I'm sure we will," I replied, slipping the receipt into my purse along with the credit card. As we prepared to leave, I excused myself to use the restroom, needing a moment away from Garrett's triumphant gloating and his colleagues' casual cruelty. The ladies' room at Pinnacle was as elegantly appointed as the rest of the restaurant. All marble surfaces and soft lighting and fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. I studied my reflection in the mirror, taking in the woman who stared back at me. Dakota Meridian Hayes, 29 years old, olive-toned skin that spoke to my Mediterranean heritage, long brown hair that I kept simply styled, and dark eyes that had seen too much disappointment in the past 3 years. I was wearing a simple black dress that I had purchased off the rack at Nordstrom, paired with modest jewelry that wouldn't draw attention or raise questions about where a museum curator might have acquired anything more expensive. But underneath that carefully constructed exterior was someone else, entirely. The real Dakota Meridian Hayes owned the building we were standing in, controlled one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in the country, and possessed enough wealth to buy and sell everyone at that dinner table several times over. The question that had been plaguing me for months was whether that person deserved better than a marriage built on lies and sustained by contempt. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text message from Wesley D., my private investigator. The preview that appeared on my lock screen was brief but intriguing. "Found what you were looking for regarding G and S. Call me when you're free to talk privately. G and S Garrett and Savannah." I had suspected for weeks that there was something more than professional collaboration happening between my husband and his colleague, something that would explain the late-night phone calls and the weekend meetings and the way she looked at him when she thought no one else was watching. If Wesley had confirmed my suspicions, then tonight's dinner had taken on an entirely different significance. I slipped the phone back into my purse and returned to the table, where Garrett was in the middle of another story about his professional achievements. The group was preparing to leave, gathering coats and purses while continuing their conversation about industry trends and office politics. I took my place beside Garrett, noting how he avoided eye contact as we prepared to walk out together. "This was fun," Savannah announced as we waited for the elevator. "We should do it again sometime. Maybe for Garrett's promotion celebration next month?" "Definitely," Quinn agreed. "Though next time, maybe we should go somewhere a little less expensive. $800 for dinner is pretty steep, even for a special occasion." The elevator arrived, and we descended in relative silence from the 52nd floor to street level. Through the glass walls of the elevator, I could see the building's impressive lobby, all polished marble and modern art installations that I had personally selected from the Meridian Foundation's collection. The security guards nodded respectfully as we passed through, but their attention seemed focused on me rather than Garrett, who was oblivious to the subtle deference they showed. On the street outside Skyline Tower, we said our goodbyes to Garrett's colleagues before beginning the walk to our car. The September evening was cool but pleasant, with a gentle breeze that carried the promise of autumn. Denver's downtown core was alive with weekend activity. Couples walking hand in hand toward bars and theaters, groups of friends laughing as they navigated the sidewalks, young professionals enjoying the kind of social freedom that came with disposable income and minimal responsibilities. "Well, that went better than expected," Garrett said as we reached our Honda Accord, the reliable but unremarkable vehicle that fit perfectly with my curator persona. "I was worried you might embarrass me in front of Quinn and the others, but you actually behaved yourself pretty well." Behaved myself, as if I were a child whose conduct needed monitoring rather than an adult woman capable of navigating social situations with grace and intelligence. The comment crystallized something that had been building in my mind throughout the evening, a recognition that this marriage had become fundamentally incompatible with any reasonable definition of respect or partnership. "I'm glad you approve," I said neutrally, unlocking the car with the key fob. We drove home in relative silence, Garrett occasionally commenting on the evening's conversations or sharing gossip about his colleagues that I found increasingly difficult to pretend to care about. Our apartment was located in a middle-class neighborhood about 15 minutes from downtown, a modest two-bedroom unit that we rented for $1,800 per month. It was comfortable but unremarkable, exactly the kind of place where a pharmaceutical regional director and a museum curator might be expected to live. What Garrett didn't know was that the rental payments were processed through a property management company that I owned, which meant that our housing costs ultimately flowed back into my own accounts. He also didn't know that I had purchased the entire building 6 months after we moved in, both as an investment opportunity and as a way to ensure that our living situation remained stable, regardless of any future changes in our relationship status. Inside our apartment, Garrett immediately headed for the kitchen to grab a beer from the refrigerator, leaving me to hang up our coats and turn on the living room lights. The space was furnished simply but tastefully, with pieces that I had selected from furniture stores that catered to young professionals with limited budgets but decent taste. None of it was expensive, but all of it was chosen with care to create an environment that felt like a real home rather than a stage set. "You know," Garrett said, returning to the living room with his beer and settling onto the couch with obvious satisfaction, "tonight really reinforced how lucky you are to be married to someone with my earning potential. I mean, $800 for dinner without blinking an eye? Most women in your position would never experience that kind of lifestyle. Most women in my position. I considered pointing out that most women in my position were actually among the wealthiest individuals in the country, but that would have defeated the purpose of maintaining my cover. Instead, I nodded and made appropriate noises while privately calculating exactly how much money I had spent on dinner, Compared to my daily income from investments and business operations, $800 represented approximately 12 minutes of passive earnings from my investment portfolio. The building we had just left generated more rental income in a single day than most people earned in a month. The pharmaceutical company that employed Garrett and his colleagues produced revenues that could fund small countries. But none of that mattered if the man I had married was incapable of loving me without the trappings of wealth to dazzle him into submission. I appreciate everything you provide for us, I said carefully, which was technically true, even if the underlying reality was more complicated than he could possibly imagine. Good, he replied, taking a long drink from his beer. Because I've been thinking about our future lately. And there are going to need to be some changes if this marriage is going to work long term. Changes. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I waited for him to continue. First, this museum job has to go. I can't have my wife working for peanuts while I'm trying to build a serious career in pharmaceutical management. It reflects poorly on both of us, and it's not like you're contributing anything meaningful to the family finances anyway. I stared at him, processing the casual way he was dismantling the life I had carefully constructed. The museum job is important to me, Garrett. It's not just about money. Everything is about money when you're an adult, he replied dismissively. And since you're clearly not capable of earning real money, your time would be better spent supporting my career in ways that actually matter. Networking events, client dinners, corporate social functions, the kind of things that help ambitious men advance their positions. Ambitious men, not ambitious couples, not ambitious families, but ambitious men who apparently required supportive wives to facilitate their success. I was beginning to understand that Garrett had never seen me as a partner in our marriage, so much as an accessory that should complement his professional image. What if I don't want to quit my job? I asked quietly. His eyes hardened in a way that made me suddenly grateful that we were having this conversation in our own living room rather than somewhere public. Then you're being selfish and short-sighted. My earning potential is significantly higher than yours will ever be, which means our joint success depends on maximizing my opportunities rather than wasting time on your hobby career. Hobby career. 3 years of graduate school, 2 years of specialized training, and 5 years of professional experience in museum curation and arts administration, reduced to a hobby that was interfering with his ambitions. I felt something fundamental shift inside me. A recognition that this conversation was revealing truths about our relationship that I could no longer ignore or rationalize away. I need to think about this, I said finally. There's nothing to think about, Garrett replied, his voice carrying the kind of finality that indicated he considered the matter settled. I'm telling you what needs to happen, not asking for your opinion. This is how successful marriages work, Dakota. One person leads, the other follows. And since I'm the one with actual career prospects, the leadership role falls to me. One person leads, the other follows. I wondered what he would say if he knew that the person he was expecting to follow him actually controlled every significant aspect of his professional life, from his salary and benefits to his office assignment and parking space allocation. I wondered how his leadership philosophy would hold up under the weight of discovering that his entire career was built on foundations that I could remove with a single phone call. But I wasn't ready to find out. Not yet. There was still one more test I needed to run. One more opportunity to see if any part of the man I had fallen in love with still existed, underneath the arrogance and entitlement that seemed to consume more of his personality with each passing month. You're probably right, I said, the lie coming easily after 3 years of practice. I should focus more on supporting your career goals. His smile was immediate and self-satisfied, the expression of a man who had just confirmed his dominance in what he perceived to be a potential power struggle. I knew you'd see reason eventually. You're smarter than most women, Dakota. That's one of the things I've always liked about you. smarter than most women. The casual sexism was breathtaking in its scope, encompassing not just me, but apparently half the human population. I filed it away with all the other comments and observations I had been collecting over the past few months, evidence of who Garrett really was when he thought he had nothing to fear from my judgment. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I declined it quickly, but Garrett's attention was immediately focused on the device in my hand. "Another mysterious phone call?" he asked, his tone suggesting suspicion rather than curiosity. "You've been getting a lot of those lately. Are you sure there's not something you want to tell me?" The irony was almost overwhelming. He was questioning my fidelity while carrying on what appeared to be an affair with a colleague, suspecting me of deception while remaining completely oblivious to the massive deception that defined our entire relationship. "Probably just a wrong number," I said, which was possible, though unlikely, given that very few people had access to my personal phone number. "Right," he said, clearly unconvinced. "Just like all those other wrong numbers you've been getting." I looked at my husband of 3 years, this man who had convinced me that he was different from all the others who had pursued me for my money, and felt the last of my romantic illusions finally crumble into dust. He wasn't different at all. He was exactly the same, just operating from a different set of assumptions about what I had to offer. The men who had pursued me when they knew about my wealth had wanted access to my money and the lifestyle it could provide. Garrett, who believed I was essentially penniless, wanted a subservient wife who would support his ambitions without requiring much in return. Both groups saw me as a means to an end, rather than a person worthy of genuine love and respect. The difference was that the gold diggers had at least been honest about their motivations. "I'm tired," I announced, standing up and heading toward the bedroom. "It's been a long evening." "Yeah, well, don't expect many more evenings like this one," Garrett called after me. $800 for dinner isn't something we can afford on a regular basis, even with my salary increases. Even with his salary increases. I paused in the doorway of our bedroom, struck by the casual assumption underlying his comment. He genuinely believed that his income was the primary financial foundation of our life together, that my contribution was so minimal as to be essentially irrelevant to our long-term financial security. If only he knew that his salary increases were approved by a board of directors that reported directly to me, that his health insurance and retirement benefits were funded by profits from companies that I owned, that his job security depended entirely on my continued willingness to maintain the fiction, that he was a valuable employee rather than an elaborate form of charity. But he would find out soon enough. I changed into pajamas and brushed my teeth, while Garrett remained in the living room, probably scrolling through his phone or watching television or doing whatever it was that men like him did when they thought they had successfully asserted their dominance over their wives. Through the thin walls of our apartment, I could hear him moving around, opening another beer, settling more firmly into the couch that I had purchased with money he didn't know I possessed. In the darkness of our bedroom, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the choices that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I had been convinced that finding authentic love required hiding my true circumstances, that money and power inevitably corrupted relationships by creating imbalances that made genuine affection impossible. Tonight, I had learned that hiding my wealth hadn't eliminated those imbalances at all. It had simply revealed different kinds of corruption, different forms of disrespect, and exploitation. Garrett didn't want my money because he didn't know I had any. But he wanted my labor, my submission, my willingness to subordinate my goals to his ambitions. He wanted a wife who would enhance his status without threatening his ego, who would provide support without requiring much investment in return. In some ways, that was worse than being pursued for my inheritance. At least the gold diggers had recognized that I possessed something valuable, even if they were focused on the wrong things. Garrett had convinced himself that marrying me was an act of charity, that I should be grateful for his willingness to overlook my obvious inadequacies in exchange for whatever modest contributions I could make to his success. But I was done being grateful for scraps of affection from men who didn't deserve access to my time, let alone my heart. I was done pretending that I needed anyone's permission to live according to my own values and ambitions. And I was definitely done protecting someone else's ego at the expense of my own dignity. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life. Not just the money and power that I had temporarily set aside, but the sense of self-worth that I had allowed 3 years of subtle degradation to slowly erode. I would remember who I was before I met Garrett Brennan, and I would become that person again. But first, I would give him one final chance to surprise me. One last opportunity to demonstrate that some vestige of the man I had fallen in love with still existed underneath the arrogance and entitlement. I would plan a test that would reveal his true character beyond any possibility of doubt or rationalization. And if he failed, as I increasingly suspected he would, then I would show him exactly what it meant to underestimate someone who had been quietly controlling his destiny from the very beginning. My phone buzzed one final time as I drifted toward sleep, a text message from an unknown number that made me sit up in bed despite the late hour. The preview on my lock screen was brief but electrifying. Ms. Meridian Hayes, this is Detective Sarah Chen. We need to discuss what your husband may have told other companies about your pharmaceutical research. This case is bigger than embezzlement. I stared at the message for a long moment, my mind racing through the implications. If law enforcement was contacting me directly about Garrett's activities, then my private investigator had uncovered something far more serious than a simple affair with a colleague. Something that threatened not just our marriage, but potentially my entire carefully constructed double life. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions I hadn't even known to ask. Tonight, I would enjoy these last few hours of ignorance, these final moments before my world changed forever. In the living room, I could hear Garrett turning off the television and making his way toward the bedroom, probably expecting to find me already asleep. I closed my eyes and regulated my breathing, feigning unconsciousness while my mind continued to race through possibilities and contingencies. He slipped into bed beside me, careful not to disturb what he assumed was my slumber. And within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. I lay there in the darkness next to the man who had just spent the evening publicly humiliating me, who had demanded that I abandon my career to better serve his ambitions, who had no idea that his entire life was sustained by my wealth and generosity. Soon, very soon, he would learn the truth about who he had married and what he had thrown away in his arrogance. Soon, he would understand that underestimating Dakota, Meridian Hayes, was the most expensive mistake he would ever make. But that revelation would have to wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I would sleep peacefully for the last time in 3 years, secure in the knowledge that I finally understood exactly what needed to be done. The quiet woman who had endured tonight's humiliation was about to discover just how powerful she could be when she stopped apologizing for taking up space in her own life. And Garrett Brennan was about to learn that some disappointments cut both ways. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, Denver's September weather turning moody as if reflecting the storm brewing in my personal life. I woke before my alarm, Garrett still sleeping soundly beside me, blissfully unaware that his world was about to implode in spectacular fashion. Detective Chen's text burned in my memory as I slipped quietly from bed and padded to the kitchen to make coffee. The message had been brief, but loaded with implications that made my stomach churn with a mixture of dread and anticipation. If law enforcement was reaching out to me directly about Garrett's activities, then Wesley Durant had uncovered something far more damaging than a simple affair. I pulled up Chen's contact information and dialed her number, stepping onto our small balcony to ensure privacy. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. Ms. Meridian Hayes, thank you for calling back so quickly. I'm Detective Sarah Chen with Denver PD's Financial Crimes Unit, working in conjunction with the FBI on a case involving pharmaceutical industry fraud. We believe your husband may be involved in activities that directly impact your family's business interests. My family's business interests. The phrase sent a chill down my spine as I realized that my carefully constructed cover was beginning to unravel from multiple directions simultaneously. What kind of activities? I asked carefully, though part of me already suspected the answer. Corporate espionage, theft of proprietary research, and embezzlement of funds designated for drug development. We've been monitoring suspicious financial transactions for the past 6 months, and your husband's name appears frequently in our investigation records. I gripped the balcony railing as the full scope of Garrett's betrayal began to crystallize. Not only had he been cheating on me emotionally and possibly physically, but he had been stealing from the company I owned, potentially compromising years of medical research that could save countless lives. How much are we talking about? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Preliminary estimates suggest at least $320,000, diverted from research and development accounts over the past 14 months. But the intellectual property theft could be worth millions. Depending on what information has been passed to competing firms, $320,000. The amount was significant enough to fund an entire research project. Money that should have been developing treatments for diseases that killed thousands of people every year. Instead, Garrett had been siphoning it off for purposes I could only imagine. Probably to maintain the lifestyle he thought he deserved. Or to impress women he was pursuing behind my back. What do you need from me? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. We'd like to meet with you today to discuss what you might know about your husband's activities and to coordinate our investigation with your company's internal security. Can you come to the federal building at 2 this afternoon? I glanced back through the sliding door at Garrett's sleeping form, sprawled across our bed without a care in the world. In a few hours, he would wake up expecting another normal Sunday, another day of taking his comfortable life for granted, while treating me like an inconvenience he had to tolerate. I'll be there, I confirmed, ending the call just as Garrett began stirring in the bedroom. The morning passed with surreal normalcy. Garrett woke around 9, showered, and settled into his weekend routine of reading financial news online while expecting me to prepare breakfast. I went through the motions of domestic harmony, scrambling eggs and making coffee while my mind raced through the implications of what I had learned. Every casual comment he made about work, every mention of his colleagues or upcoming projects, now carried the weight of potential evidence in a federal investigation. When he complained about a delayed research report from the lab, I wondered if the delay was connected to his theft of funding. When he bragged about impressing clients with his knowledge of proprietary drug formulations, I realized he might be selling company secrets to competitors. "You're quiet this morning," he observed around 11, looking up from his laptop with the kind of superficial concern that didn't require much effort to maintain. "Just thinking about work," I replied honestly, though not in the way he would interpret it. "Right, the museum," he said dismissively. "Well, don't think too hard about it, since you'll be giving notice soon anyway." The casual cruelty of his assumption that he could dictate my career choices without my input was breathtaking, but I managed to maintain my composure. In a few hours, he would discover that I had been making decisions about his career for years without his knowledge or consent. And the power dynamic he thought he understood would reveal itself to be completely inverted. My phone buzzed with a text from Autumn Blackwood. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 9. Need to discuss security breach and personnel issues. Your presence required as majority shareholder." Majority shareholder. The words I had been hiding from for 3 years. The identity I had suppressed in hopes of finding authentic love. Tomorrow, I would walk into that boardroom as myself for the first time since marrying Garrett, and the fiction that had sustained our relationship would finally be exposed. "Who keeps texting you?" Garrett asked, his tone carrying the kind of possessive irritation that had become increasingly common in recent months. Work stuff, I said vaguely, which was technically accurate. On Sunday? What kind of museum emergency requires text messages? I looked at my husband, this man who had convinced himself that he was the ambitious one in our marriage, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. The kind that involves protecting valuable assets from people who might try to steal them. He stared at me for a moment, clearly puzzled by my tone. But before he could probe deeper, his own phone rang with a call from Quinn Sterling. He answered immediately, his voice shifting into the artificially confident register he used for work conversations. Quinn, hey, what's up? Yeah, I saw the email about tomorrow's quarterly review meeting. No problem, I'll be there. I listened to his side of the conversation with new understanding. The quarterly review meeting he was discussing was actually the emergency board meeting that Autumn had just texted me about. In a few hours, Quinn and the other executives he considered his peers would discover that their jobs depended entirely on the approval of the woman he had been treating like a disappointment and a burden. After he hung up, Garrett seemed energized in a way that I now recognized as anticipatory greed. Big week coming up at work. Quinn thinks I'm definitely getting that promotion to senior regional director. The timing couldn't be better. The timing couldn't be worse, actually, but I didn't point that out. Instead, I nodded and made encouraging noises while privately calculating how quickly his career would evaporate once the FBI investigation became public knowledge. At 1:30, I announced that I was going shopping and would be back in a few hours. Garrett barely looked up from his laptop, absorbed in whatever online research he was conducting. Probably looking up salary ranges for senior management positions he would never be eligible for, or researching luxury cars he would never be able to afford. The federal building in downtown Denver was an imposing structure of glass and steel that housed multiple law enforcement agencies, from local police departments to FBI field offices. I had visited once before, years ago, when I first inherited control of Meridian Pharmaceuticals and needed security clearance for government contracts. That visit had been routine, professional, forgettable. This one would change everything. Detective Chen met me in the lobby, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who moved with the kind of focused efficiency that suggested she had been investigating financial crimes for most of her career. She guided me through security checkpoints and up to a conference room on the 8th floor, where FBI Special Agent Rodriguez was waiting with a thick file folder and a laptop computer. Ms. Meridian Hayes, Agent Rodriguez began, we appreciate your cooperation with this investigation. Before we begin, we need to confirm your current relationship with Meridian Pharmaceuticals and your access to company financial records. I took a deep breath, knowing that my answer would begin the process of dismantling the carefully constructed life I had built over the past 3 years. I am the majority owner and chairman of the board. I inherited the company from my parents and have been actively involved in its management since I was 21 years old. Detective Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. And your husband is unaware of your position within the company? Completely unaware. He knows me as Dakota Hayes, a museum curator who makes $45,000 a year. He has no idea that I control the company he works for, or that I have been monitoring his performance and behavior for the duration of our marriage. Agent Rodriguez opened the laptop and turned the screen toward me, displaying a series of financial transactions that painted a damning picture of systematic theft and corporate espionage. Wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, payments to competitors for proprietary research data, forged authorizations for research fund disbursements. These transactions all bear your husband's digital signature and access codes, he explained. But they were processed outside normal company protocols and without proper oversight approval. I studied the records, my anger building as the scope of Garrett's betrayal became clear. Not only had he been stealing money, but he had been selling research data to competitors, potentially compromising drug development projects that could save lives and generate billions in legitimate revenue. How long has this been going on? I asked, though the dates on the transactions already told most of the story. At least 14 months, possibly longer. The investigation began when one of your competitors approached the FBI about suspicious offers to sell proprietary pharmaceutical research. When we traced the source of those offers, they led back to your husband. 14 months. That meant Garrett had been systematically betraying me and the company almost from the moment I had trusted him enough to share basic information about my work. Every casual conversation about museum acquisition budgets, every discussion of authentication procedures and research protocols had been feeding into a criminal enterprise that threatened everything my parents had built. What evidence do you have besides the financial records? I asked, slipping into the analytical mindset that had served me well in corporate boardrooms. Detective Chen pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of photographs taken with telephoto lenses. Garrett meeting with representatives from competing pharmaceutical companies in restaurant parking lots. Garrett using a portable scanner to copy documents from his office briefcase. Garrett accessing computer systems after hours when most employees had gone home. We've been surveilling him for 6 weeks, she explained. The evidence is substantial enough to support multiple felony charges, including corporate espionage, wire fraud, and money laundering. I stared at the photographs, seeing my husband engaged in activities that revealed him to be not just unfaithful and disrespectful, but genuinely criminal. The man I had married, the person I had hoped might love me for who I was rather than what I owned, had been systematically destroying the very foundation of our life together. When are you planning to make arrests? I asked. Tomorrow morning, during the board meeting your attorney scheduled. We want to coordinate with your company's internal investigation to ensure that all evidence is preserved and that any co-conspirators are identified. Co-conspirators! The word sent a chill through me as I realized that Garrett's crimes might have involved other people I knew, possibly including the colleagues who had humiliated me at dinner the night before. Agent Rodriguez sensed my concern and leaned forward slightly. Based on our investigation, we believe your husband has been working with at least one other Meridian employee to access restricted research data and facilitate the transfer of proprietary information. We'll know more after tomorrow's arrests. I thought about Quinn Sterling's overfamiliar behavior toward Garrett, about the way she had looked at him during dinner, about the late-night phone calls and weekend meetings that I had assumed were romantic in nature. Now I wondered if their relationship was primarily criminal, a partnership built on greed rather than attraction. What do you need me to do? I asked, recognizing that my role in this investigation was shifting from victim to active participant. Tomorrow morning, conduct the board meeting as planned. Discuss the security breaches and personnel issues your attorney mentioned, but don't reveal the specific details of our investigation. When we arrive with arrest warrants, act surprised but cooperative. Your genuine shock at learning about your husband's activities will be important for establishing your innocence in the matter. Genuine shock. If only they knew that my shock wasn't about discovering Garrett's criminal activities, but about finally understanding the complete extent of his betrayal. The man I had married wasn't just selfish and disrespectful. He was a criminal who had been systematically stealing from me while treating me like a burden he had to endure. We spent another hour reviewing evidence and coordinating procedures for the next morning's arrests. By the time I left the federal building, the gray afternoon had turned into a steady drizzle that matched my mood perfectly. The drive home gave me time to process what I had learned and to prepare mentally for the confrontation that awaited me. Garrett was exactly where I had left him, sprawled on the couch with his laptop, probably researching vacation destinations he planned to visit with money he had stolen from my company. He looked up when I entered, his expression mildly curious about my shopping expedition. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, the question loaded with more irony than he could possibly realize. "Very interesting," I replied truthfully. "I learned some things about people I thought I knew well." He nodded absently and returned to his screen, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife had just spent 3 hours coordinating his arrest with federal law enforcement. I watched him for a moment, studying the face that had smiled at me during our wedding ceremony, that had whispered promises about love and partnership and growing old together. None of it had been real. Not his affection, not his respect, not his commitment to building a life together. Everything had been a performance designed to maintain access to whatever benefits he thought marriage to me provided, while he pursued his own interests without regard for the damage he was causing. That evening, we ate dinner in relative silence, Garrett occasionally commenting on work gossip or weekend plans, while I nodded and responded appropriately. He had no idea that this was our last normal evening together, that by tomorrow night, he would be in federal custody, facing charges that could send him to prison for decades. As we prepared for bed, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. Tomorrow, after the arrests and the board meeting and the media coverage that would inevitably follow, I would file for divorce, not because I wanted revenge, though I certainly deserved it, but because I finally understood that our marriage had been built on lies from the very beginning. Garrett had never loved Dakota, the museum curator, any more than my previous boyfriends had loved Dakota, the pharmaceutical heiress. He had simply been attracted to a different set of benefits, a different form of exploitation. The common thread was that none of them had been interested in loving me as a complete person, with all the complexity and contradiction that real relationships require. I lay awake most of the night, listening to Garrett's peaceful breathing and thinking about the choices that had brought us to this moment. In the morning, I would walk into that boardroom as myself for the first time in 3 years, and I would begin the process of rebuilding my life on a foundation of honesty rather than hope. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I was already awake, mentally prepared for what promised to be one of the most challenging days of my life. Garrett stirred beside me, checking his phone and stretching with the casual confidence of someone who expected the day ahead to bring professional triumph. "Big day today," he announced, heading for the shower. "Quinn thinks the board is finally ready to announce my promotion. All that networking and relationship building is about to pay off. All that theft and corporate espionage was about to result in federal charges." But I didn't correct his misunderstanding. Instead, I made coffee and toast while he showered and dressed in his best suit, the navy Armani that he had purchased with money stolen from research budgets. At 8:15, we left the apartment together, Garrett chattering excitedly about his expectations for the meeting, while I maintained appropriate enthusiasm for his career prospects. He had no idea that we were driving toward his professional and personal destruction, or that the woman sitting beside him in the passenger seat was about to reveal herself as the architect of everything he had spent 3 years taking for granted. The Skyline Tower looked exactly the same as it had 2 nights earlier when we had dinner at Pinnacle. But everything felt different as we rode the elevator to the 23rd floor. Garrett was reviewing notes on his phone, probably preparing talking points for a promotion he would never receive, while I mentally rehearsed the most difficult performance of my life. The boardroom was already crowded when we arrived, with Autumn Blackwood coordinating seating arrangements, while FBI agents positioned themselves discreetly near the exits. Quinn Sterling and Reed Hartwell were huddled in conversation by the windows, their expressions suggesting they had no idea what was about to unfold. Savannah Cross sat alone at the conference table, scrolling through her phone with the kind of bored expression that suggested she considered this meeting a waste of her time. Garrett took a seat near the head of the table, positioning himself where he assumed the good news about his promotion would be announced. I walked to the opposite end of the room and took my place at the head of the table, in the chair reserved for the chairman of the board. The conversation in the room gradually died as people noticed my position and began to process what it might mean. Quinn Sterling frowned and whispered something to Reed Hartwell, who shook his head in confusion. Savannah Cross looked up from her phone with the first glimmer of genuine interest she had shown all morning. But it was Garrett's reaction that captured my attention. He stared at me with complete bewilderment. clearly unable to reconcile the woman he knew as a struggling museum curator with the person who had just assumed the most powerful position in the room. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice carrying the kind of authority that I had been suppressing for 3 years. "Thank you all for attending this emergency board meeting. Before we begin, I should probably introduce myself properly to those of you who don't already know me." I stood and walked to the presentation screen at the front of the room, connecting my laptop with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been running corporate meetings for years. The first slide appeared, showing the Meridian Pharmaceuticals organizational chart with my name at the top as Chairman and Chief Executive Officer. I am Dakota Meridian Hayes, majority owner and chairman of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. I inherited this company from my parents 8 years ago and have been actively involved in its management and strategic direction throughout that time. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the sound of Garrett's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up abruptly. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice carrying a note of panic that suggested he was beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of reality. "I'm revealing information that I should have shared years ago," I replied calmly. "Information about who I am, what I own, and what I've discovered about the people I trusted with access to this company's resources." Agent Rodriguez chose that moment to enter the boardroom, flanked by 2 other FBI agents and Detective Chen. The sight of law enforcement officers caused immediate tension throughout the room, with several people standing and demanding explanations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Rodriguez announced, his voice cutting through the confusion, "I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We have warrants for the arrest of several individuals in connection with corporate espionage, embezzlement, and wire fraud involving Meridian Pharmaceuticals." He moved directly toward Garrett, who had gone pale and was backing toward the windows, as if he might somehow escape through the 53rd floor glass. "Garrett Brennan, you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, theft of proprietary corporate information, and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage." The sound of handcuffs clicking into place was unnaturally loud in the quiet boardroom. Garrett's eyes found mine across the room, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that might have been genuine fear. "Dakota," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I don't understand. You're a museum curator. You make $45,000 a year. This doesn't make sense." "No, Garrett," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning in my chest. "What doesn't make sense is how you convinced yourself that you could steal $320,000 from my company while treating me like a disappointment you had to tolerate." Agent Rodriguez was reading him his rights when Detective Chen approached Quinn Sterling with a second set of handcuffs. Quinn's face went white as she realized that her involvement in Garrett's criminal enterprise had been discovered and documented. "Quinn Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate espionage and accessory to wire fraud." The remaining board members watched in stunned silence as 2 of their colleagues were led away in handcuffs, their careers and reputations destroyed in a matter of minutes. Reed Hartwell and Savannah Cross exchanged panicked glances, probably wondering if they were about to be arrested as well. After the arrests, I remained at the head of the conference table while FBI agents finished collecting evidence and taking preliminary statements from the remaining employees. The boardroom felt different now, cleaned of the toxic influence that had been corrupting it for months, while I had been pretending to be someone else. "Ms. Meridian Hayes," Autumn Blackwood said finally, breaking the stunned silence that had settled over the room. "What are your instructions regarding the positions that Mr. Brennan and Ms. Sterling have vacated?" I looked around the table at the remaining executives, these people who had witnessed my public humiliation 2 nights earlier, without understanding that they were watching their employer be disrespected by a criminal. Some of them looked ashamed, others confused, but all of them were clearly waiting for direction about how to proceed. Mr. Hartwell, I said, addressing the research director directly, you are hereby promoted to Senior Vice President of Research and Development, effective immediately. Ms. Cross, you will assume Ms. Sterling's responsibilities as Acting Vice President of Sales until we can conduct a proper search for her replacement. Both of them nodded gratefully, probably relieved to discover that their careers would survive the scandal that had just destroyed their colleagues. As for Mr. Brennan's position, I continued, we will not be filling it. The regional director role has been eliminated as part of a broader restructuring initiative that I will be announcing over the next few weeks. The meeting continued for another hour as we discussed security protocols, investigated procedures, and the media strategy we would need to manage the inevitable publicity surrounding the arrests. By the time everyone left, it was nearly noon, and I was emotionally and physically exhausted from maintaining my composure through the most challenging morning of my professional life. I remained in the boardroom alone for several minutes, looking out at the Denver skyline through the floor to ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below. Somewhere in that urban landscape, Garrett was probably being processed through the federal detention system, beginning to understand the true scope of the life he had thrown away through greed and betrayal. My phone buzzed with a text message from Wesley Durant. Saw the news coverage. Congratulations on finally getting justice. Your next challenge may be bigger than you realize. Call me when you're ready to discuss the international connections we've uncovered. International connections. The investigation that I thought was ending with Garrett's arrest was apparently just beginning, extending into areas that could threaten not just Meridian Pharmaceuticals, but the broader pharmaceutical industry. But that was a problem for another day. Today, I had finally reclaimed my identity and my power. I had stopped apologizing for taking up space in my own life, and I had demonstrated that underestimating Dakota Meridian Hayes was a mistake that carried serious consequences. I packed up my laptop and prepared to leave the building I owned, thinking about the choices that lay ahead. Tomorrow, I would file for divorce. Next week, I would move out of the apartment that I had been renting for myself. Next month, I would begin rebuilding my personal life on a foundation of honesty rather than hope. The elevator descended from the 53rd floor to street level, carrying me away from the boardroom where my marriage had effectively ended and toward whatever came next. Through the glass walls of the elevator, I could see the lobby where security guards nodded respectfully, finally able to acknowledge openly what they had always known about my true position in their world. Outside on the street, Denver's afternoon sun had burned through the morning drizzle, creating the kind of crisp September day that reminded people why they chose to live in Colorado. I walked toward my Honda Accord, parked in the same space where Garrett and I had left it together just a few hours earlier, when he had still believed that his biggest problem was whether he would get a promotion. As I drove home to the apartment that would soon be empty of his belongings and his presence, I thought about the 3 years I had spent trying to find authentic love by hiding my authentic self. The experiment had been a failure, but not for the reasons I had originally feared. The problem hadn't been that my wealth made genuine relationships impossible. The problem had been that I had chosen partners who were incapable of genuine relationships, regardless of my financial circumstances. Garrett had been just as exploitative and disrespectful as a middle-class husband as my previous boyfriends had been as potential gold diggers. The lesson wasn't that rich people couldn't find love. The lesson was that love required honesty, respect, and genuine care for the other person's well-being. Money could complicate those requirements, but it couldn't eliminate them or substitute for their absence. Tonight, I would sleep alone in the bed I had shared with a criminal who had spent 3 years systematically betraying me while making me feel grateful for his attention. Tomorrow, I would wake up as myself for the first time since our wedding day, free to build a life that reflected my actual values and priorities, rather than someone else's expectations about who I should be. The quiet woman who had endured years of subtle degradation was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept anything less than what she deserved. Garrett Brennan had wanted a disappointing wife he could control and dismiss. Instead, he had gotten Dakota Meridian Hayes, and that mistake would define the rest of his life. But my story was just beginning. The international connections Wesley had mentioned, the broader implications of the corporate espionage case, the challenge of rebuilding both my personal and professional life on more honest foundations. All of that lay ahead. Complicated, but no longer constrained by the need to pretend I was someone else. I parked in the driveway of the apartment building I owned and walked up the stairs to the unit I had been renting for myself, knowing that this would be one of the last times I would need to maintain any fiction about who I was or what I was capable of achieving. The disappointment Garrett had toasted on my birthday was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that the most powerful revenge wasn't destruction, but simply refusing to accept less than what you deserved and having the resources to enforce that decision. The real story was only just beginning, and this time, it would be told with complete honesty about who I was and what I had built from the ashes of other people's underestimation.